Hello, and welcome to the Thinking Elixir podcast, where we cover the news of the community and learn from each other. My name is Mark Erickson.
And I'm Lars Wikman.
Thank you, Lars, for joining us. You're here to help me report on the news, and then we want to talk a little bit more specifically about what's you're up to, but also what's going on in the Nerves community, because I think you kind of seem to be active over there too. So welcome, Lars.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the show. First time in ages. Or have I ever been on Thinking Elixir? Or was I only on your old show?
I don't remember. We're trying to rectify that right now. But for now, let's get into the news. So this week has been a big week for releases. So we have Phoenix LiveView 1.0 was finally officially released. And then we also have Elixir 1.18, which is shortly to be released, may even be released by the time you hear this. So we have a lot to try and cover, plus a few other smaller things. But yeah, LiveView, let's start talking about this. So there is a blog post that goes along with it on the phoenixframework.org blog, and we've got a link to that. And then there's the changelog. So of course, last time we recorded, the Phoenix LiveView release came one day later. So of course we couldn't talk about it. And we sound really dumb talking about the release candidate and everything as everyone's like celebrating 1.0 is released.
It's perfect. It's the curse of not doing live, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
But also unavoidable.
That's true. Well, we've also got some links to Chris McCord talking about the announcement. And there were some interesting things here with this. So one, the blog post, it's not so much about, hey, here's what's new in Phoenix LiveView. I liked it because it was almost like a retrospective. Like, here's the journey that brought us to where we are and the motivations for why Chris even went on this mission. What was this all about? And that it's been 6 years since the initial commit.
I need to start my project with the commit, make it so, or something to that effect. Like I need to put more drama in my initial commit, not just initial commit or arg. That's some good prep.
Yes. Yeah. He's able to show that 6 years ago, make it so with the little chick
with a
and
chicken
flame.
And fire. Yeah. I guess Phoenix. Yes.
Yep.
Firebird. Got there eventually.
It's a great blog post just giving some ideas about, the real-time aspects of Phoenix and what it's all about, how it started. And then he talks about, how there's stream and async and how you have interactive uploads and all these different features like Heeks markup. And, you're getting compilation tests and checks for validity of the DOM. That's in there. All this great stuff and how LiveView has gone mainstream. And Chris credits saying that LiveView and .NET Blazor both started out about the same time. And he thinks that both projects helped spearhead the adoption of this programming model. And this programming model being server-side, state-managed, and pushing updates down to the client. It's a whole different paradigm, right? Like, I remember when LiveView first came out, it was trying to get your head around it was the challenge of, why do I need this? And what is this doing for me? And people just not getting it. It's like, oh no, this means I don't have object serialization. I don't have a JSON API or GraphQL API. I can just get immediate stuff happening on my page as I click. It's like instant.
Yeah, for me, I think it hit almost immediately because I had been trying to build a small SaaS app effort on my own. And just like, I'm building an API layer, and then I'm building a JavaScript API client, and yada. Of course, you can generate some of that, but you still end up needing to continuously develop that layer instead of just the interactions. And in many, many cases, you just need the interactions. It's also been interesting to see that like the Elixir community did not wait for 1.0. Like if you talk to most Elixir developers, LiveView is considered like a fact of life. It's not like bleeding edge, something you might try. It is something that people use in production every day. The 1.0 stamp is for other people and potentially for the Phoenix team to sort of take a breather and consider it like, okay, we're in maintenance mode for a little bit. We'll find out if they have a lot of stuff in store. Maybe they just wanted to get Bruce and Sophie off the hook for the book. I don't know. But I think they also introduced some revisions for the book with the 1.0. So curly braces. That's just all I'm going to say. Curly braces.
Yeah. And it was really funny because we were just reviewing that as we were looking through the changelog this morning. And I didn't see curly braces mentioned in the changelog, which is interesting. You know, it's not like, hey, we're deprecating the old way that you've been doing it all this time. That's not happening.
The thing I found was under enhancements for 1.0.0 RC8, extend Heek's curly at foo syntax for interpolating variables inside tag bodies.
Yep.
So they consider it just a slight extension of how we do attributes, right?
A slight enhancement, yes.
Yeah.
And really, like, you got to check out the changelog. So we got a link to it, right? You got to check it out because as you're scrolling through, you just see, you know, we've had RCs. There were 9 RCs. It went from, you know, the official release was December 3rd, and the first RC was June. Actually, RC0 was May.
Yeah.
Was May 8th. And so in that period of time, there have been so many fixes and little things that just saying enhancements. And when you talk about curly braces being just, oh, it's just an enhancement. It's like, how many other gems are buried in this changelog?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot. It's going to be an interesting update, see if anything breaks. I heard there were, I asked one of my co-founders, like, okay, so who's doing Phoenix LiveView 1.0 on the app now? And he's like, I looked at it. I looked at the curly braces. There seemed like there might still be dragons there. So I think there were some bugs or challenges discovered with the curly brace thing specifically, or it was just a little bit too new for his flavor. I don't know for sure. But I have colleagues who are very, very keen to get away from the angle brackets and percent signs. Me, I just feel like I'm doing PHP a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny because it's just habit now, but I do see people who are coming new to the language struggling with knowing when to do curly brackets in attributes and angle brackets in the body. It's like, why do I do it this way?
So and when is there an equal sign?
Yeah, exactly. And if you forget that equal sign, then nothing's happening on your page. I hadn't even thought about that, like with the angle bracket of saying return something versus, and I guess it's like a code smell, really. You shouldn't be doing things in your template where you're just saying, do something to assign a variable that I'm going to be using later, because like that kind of breaks the whole Heeks model.
Yeah. And then there was something about a one-line Phoenix installer. It was credited to Wojtek Mach's work on elixirinstall.org. So this seems to be popping off in the community in general. Like I've seen this for Beamup, I believe Tristan Slaughter did. Yeah, I think people are trying to hone in on like good ways of getting this all installed, like removing that initial bump, and getting from 0 to Phoenix quickly would certainly be something.
Yeah, and really hitting the 1.0 kind of is like we were talking about, like it's a marketing stamp as well. But I mean, honestly, with so many bug fixes in it, and there's things that I had reported maybe a month ago or so, and it was fixed in this, in previous, as part of the RC flow. And so I'm excited for all of the things that are in this release. That was one of the big things, was this whole idea of how do we make it easier for people to try it out, the helping with the adoption. So 1.0 gives that stamp, like some people in enterprise situations or whatever, they're just like, hey, I won't look at it if it's not 1.0. This makes it so some people who just have that mental rule, hey, now you can look at it. And then these one-click installers, what they're doing is it's a one-line curl statement or command that downloads and runs a shell script. But there's also a Windows version too. What it does is, even if you don't have Elixir installed, it installs an Elixir, thanks to Wojtek Mach's work on the elixirinstall.org. But it installs an Elixir, installs Phoenix, generates a Phoenix project, and opens it up so you can immediately start coding. So that is an awesome way to just like onboard quickly to get people into the experience of working with Phoenix applications and LiveView and code. Yeah. So that'll be an interesting one to see how that helps adoption.
Yeah. Lowering that barrier, like the combo of needing to install both Erlang and Elixir has always been a little bit of a bump. And then there's like helpful tooling around that. But then you have to install the helpful tooling, right? So these one-line scripts are helpful, not necessarily for us that's been around for eternity now. I toy around with Elixir versions too often to sort of sit and futz with the one-liners. But helping people get started could definitely be better. And like filing down those rough edges should be a constant thing.
And I noticed that LiveView native was updated to now be based on LiveView 1.0. When I saw that, I just thought, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We're going to see a lot of other libraries that are dependent on LiveView having updates pretty quickly to the 1.0 version. So I think that will actually help push adoption. Like it'll push other projects to move up to 1.0 because it's like all the other dependencies are moving up too.
Yeah. I saw that Brian Cardrella posted a retrospective of LiveView and the Phoenix work on the Dockyard blog as well, congratulating the team on 1.0. So that might also be worth a read if you want more of the history, and the effort started during Chris's time at Dockyard, so it was certainly worth the shout out. And then we have Elixir 1.18, or as far as I can tell, it's 1.18 RC0.
Yes.
So I think we're in the RC cycle for this one.
Well, I will say, Jose reached out and said that it's been confirmed that we can go ahead and talk about this because it will be released either by the time this episode is out or the week of.
Okay. So it will be golden.
Yes. So it's okay. It's like, yes, we are good to say 118.
Not just try it and give feedback, but actually just try it and enjoy it. Because it's going to be perfect.
This is it.
That's what we hear. Okay. So the biggest things are along the lines of the improvements to the set theoretic types and the work on the language servers. But I'll set both of those aside and just go for something I saw a lovely talk at Codebeam Berlin about, where Michał Muskala talked about his work on bringing an improved version of the JSON library that he made. So, of course, we're talking about JSON for Elixir, that he then turned into an official proposal for, so an EEP, Erlang enhancement proposal, to get JSON into Erlang as lowercase JSON. And then, of course, as that happened, it made sense to make an Elixir version of that that's in the standard library called all caps JSON. And this is his long-term plan for completely deprecating his maintainer duties of JSON, which are quite limited because there's very little action in JSON. It has worked well for a long time. And I believe newer versions of the old JSON library will actually just call the standard library ones. I believe that's the plan. And then as fewer and fewer use it, it can be put to rest. That's a fun one, but not one of the bigger ones, perhaps, though it is significant. And the performance work he did on that library is fascinating. So when that talk comes out, do give it a listen. But no, everyone's here for types, right? They did something with the types. Let's see. It was something about structs and like, I don't care that much about types. Do you?
Oh, I do. Okay. Now, I am not a static type person, right? I have worked in dynamic languages and static type languages, and there are benefits to both. I totally see that, and I appreciate the differences. And that's what makes me so excited about this set theoretic types, is how gradual they can be, like how much we can infer just by the code. So we're going to go through some of the changelog items for Elixir 1.18. I've got a link to that changelog. It's really well written, and it has a lot of code examples that I really encourage you to go check out. It also gives additional details and links to more documentation. But the big one with this type system improvement is the type checking of function calls alongside gradual inference of patterns and return types. So like, all right, what does that mean? This means that the type system can infer a function's type from a function header that performs a pattern match. Like say you have a pattern match on a user struct. So now the type system can say, oh, that takes a user struct. And any later calls anywhere else in the code to that function with something else that's not a user struct will result in a compile time error or a warning. And that is like really powerful, that it can look at the set of, if you have multiple function bodies and multiple function pattern matching heads, where you can say, oh, it can take a user struct or a customer struct or whatever, you can have different things. It can, with set theoretic types, it can say, oh, well, this is what it is. And that's all without you or, the developer having to declare any types. You're not having to use the new type syntax to say, this is the type and this is the return type. It can just infer all of that. And really the huge benefit for this is, like, I can have a huge project, right? I can have my big work project. It's been going for years. And now I can bring in Elixir 1.18 and get an immediate benefit without having to go fix or decorate functions with type declarations. Like, they're just immediately going to start getting this benefit of saying, oh, you're calling it somewhere else and you don't have any pattern match heads for that. And so we're going to let you know ahead of time. Now, how likely is that particular problem? Maybe not. But that's where like this other benefit comes in, right? It's able to look at the function body to say, what is returned? Say somewhere else you're calling this function and you have a case statement where you're pattern matching on the return types of it, and you pattern match on something that it doesn't return. With Dialyzer, you could say, these are the returns, and then you'd get like a Dialyzer warning. Well, this is a type system warning that's compile time. And it says, hey, you're pattern matching on something over here in a case that is never returned from this function. That's identifying dead code. That's what that's doing. And like, that's really neat. And so like, I get that benefit and I don't have to do anything to my code, like to get that benefit. I just update to 1.18.
And you can sort of trigger it in your code by being a little bit aggressive with your pattern matching, which is usually something it's nice to do just because it helps document your inputs in many cases. It's just like, oh, we want to know that we're dealing with a struct here. I've worked with people that had the habit of doing that just because it informed the Dialyzer type inference, which in turn informed their dev tools. So I don't know if you've seen in Elixir LS, you got these suggested specs. This person did not sort of click the suggested spec to insert that spec. He just used it as sort of, oh, this is what it thinks the type is right now. And used that to write tighter typed code, but fully dynamically. I believe his code will definitely see a lot of advantage from this, but he might already have most of that from that practice. But yeah, this is super interesting. I really like that it does not require any annotation. And what I've seen of the annotations, I actually look forward to when they show up, because for a while we'll probably be writing both them and type specs when we feel the need. But the new type annotations, I think, are kind of neat. They seem very straightforward, mostly, unless you do something weird, in which case that's probably your problem.
One of the things I like about the type specs is, like Dialyzer ones, is that it shows up in the documentation, and in my Elixir LS tools, I can hover and see, it's like, oh yeah, what are my return types on this? Like, lots of times that's all I'm looking for. I do look forward to having the new type system types being something that's fully integrated into the tooling and into the documentation. Yeah, I haven't seen examples of that yet, but that's really the thing I'm looking for.
Then there's the improvements to ExUnit. So now we have this one is fun to try to pronounce. Parameterized tests to run the same test module multiple times under different parameters. There's a bunch of cases where this could work, but it could be numeric. It could be because you're targeting different sort of devices or different platforms or there's a ton of different cases where this might matter, but you want to run the same tests, and there's a few things that change. Now they've then also added support for running some of these tests concurrently based on grouping. So there's constraints about like they can't share state and yada yada, but fundamentally it lets you make a bunch of test cases run in parallel with a bunch of different parameters where that makes sense to you. I suggest reading up on this in case you're curious, because it is fairly particular as far as a feature goes.
Yeah, I think people are going to misunderstand this one a lot, and I think it's going to be a real common issue, just because we have seen other examples of parameterized tests where like an individual test will be run multiple times with different parameters. This is really at the module level, right? This is where you say this set of tests are all talking to my Cassandra database, and this other set of tests in a different module are all talking to my Postgres database. Maybe I have shared state and I can't run all of my Postgres database tests asynchronously. They need to be run separately. But there's no reason I can't run my Postgres database tests while my Cassandra tests are running, because they're completely different. So it takes some awareness, right, of what you're testing, how the states are being managed for these different types of tests. And you're saying, well, all the tests in this module, they don't have anything to do with the Postgres one. They're all file system. These do have state. They are all MongoDB or Cassandra or something else or Redis, and state is important. Grouping them at that level. So you're saying, I can run them concurrently and synchronously by those groups. I don't know how many people are actually going to use that in a smaller project.
No, I can see it happening for some of the larger code bases I've worked with, where it's like, oh, these are just a bunch of pure tests.
Yeah.
And we can run them as quickly as possible, as parallel as possible. And then we have these integration-ish style tests, or things where we need to mock an entire service, or it's like that type of test that needs to run very carefully. So this is two different features that I blasted through, because the parameterized tests, that's a separate thing where you may have a parameter that you want to run a module multiple times based on, but then you also have this functionality of test groups, and that's where you can specify that particular parts of your test suite should be able to run.
Yeah, so definitely want to check out the changelog on that one. And next up, another big feature was we've talked about this before. We've seen this we've mentioned it in the news. It's the mix format gets this official new explicit -- migrate flag. And what this is doing is it converts constructs that have been deprecated in Elixir and converts them to their latest version. And they give a clarifying note. They say, because this flag rewrites the AST, it is not guaranteed that the migrated format will always be valid when used in combination with macros that also perform AST rewriting. So yeah, I can see that, especially if they're custom macros. If they're part of Ecto or something like that are very known and understood, yeah, it's going to be able to be okay with that. But if you've got your own custom macros that are rewriting the AST, it's like, might have some issues.
Yeah, you can do some wild stuff in macros. Fair enough.
Yeah, so just a heads up on that. But it does really three things right now. And the big one is the removal of the unless keyword. And that's being turned into a negated if. And a couple other minor ones is it normalizes parenthesis in bit strings. It's like, yeah, you can see an example in the code. It's edge case. I don't know that I don't use bit strings really much in normal projects. Maybe you would more in Nerves. I don't know. When you're dealing with protocols. And
I was like, I missed this. Oh, so it strips out the parentheses
for built-in
some
types.
Of them. All right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very fringe case.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever added a parentheses to binary that way.
Yeah, well,
maybe not.
Now you know you could have, and then it will remove it for you.
Yes.
And then the other thing is it changes char lists to use the sigil C instead of the previous option, which was the single tick quotes. So just standardizing and normalizing that.
Yeah, I guess they're just trying to get away from the single tick because people get tripped up on what a string is, probably.
Yes, especially if you're coming from JavaScript, where it could be single tick or double quote, and you're like, that's the same thing to me.
Bash or PHP or Python for a while, but then it changed. And yeah, every language has had some kind of fight around single and double ticks, I think. It means something in every language, seemingly. And we have the first official release that relates to the language server effort, because we had, what was it, 3 of them?
Yeah,
people were working on at once, and they merged them together and part of that effort is getting better support for building a good language server into Elixir. And this introduces locks and listeners for compilations. So currently, all language server implementations have their own compilation environment, meaning it's separate from what you are building when you're starting your dev server and all of that. That means every time you're using your language server, it is separately compiling the project. You might have seen like mix steps get fired off by your language server while you were in the midst of typing it, and you're like, I wonder what happens now. And this should sort of pin that down. There's a compiler lock, and I believe there's also a deps get lock, which will ensure that only a single operating system process can compile that particular Elixir project at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And it also allows other processes to listen in on the compilation results, so that if you're compiling the project, your language server can pick up on the results. If the language server is compiling the project, your tooling or anything else you're doing can pick up on the results. And you won't have this weirdness where they go out of phase. So if you need to clean out your builds and all of that and rebuild, your language server should be able to pick that up. And dear Lord, I have been in some projects where the tooling just fell apart because the build was kind of odd, or the structure was kind of odd, or there was some module it just would choke on. And so this should be a very good step in the right direction.
Yeah, one of the things I was surprised to see in this documentation or the changelog was how that listener can work with like IEX, for example, and Phoenix as well. But like the IEX example was you can invoke IEX and using the configure auto reload true, IEX will automatically reload modules that you're changing somewhere else on the file system or in your IDE, and your IEX just picks it up. Like that's really cool that these other Elixir running processes can pick up on compilation changes.
Yeah, that's going to be lovely.
Because lots of times I'd be running my project and I'd have to say recompile and in my IEX because I wanted to get the latest thing. It's like, I think that might just be able to pick it up now.
Yeah. Or even specify which specific module to recompile, because sometimes it doesn't detect the changes the way you'd hope. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It should lead to a lot of improvements in the tooling, and I really look forward to seeing what comes out of the language server efforts.
Oh, yes. And the last thing that was mentioned in the Elixir 1.18 changelog was the potential incompatibilities. And really, they were super minor. But I thought it was really kind of interesting to look at them. Really, what it comes down to is, hey, we can now detect some really weird code that doesn't make sense, and we're just not going to accept it. So it's like circular variable declarations, things like that. It's like, okay, yeah, yeah, those shouldn't be allowed. So it's able to detect that, and the changelog says, hey, if you were doing that, this is how you can just rewrite it. But really, what that tells me is this feels like a very safe release in terms of we shouldn't expect problems like, oh, this is going to be breaking something in any big way.
No, it seems mostly additive. I think some really creative variable binding people might be upset by this, but I suppose they will have to be. All right. Now, for the real news, for the breaking news, this is like I hit publish on the draft of this release just like 30 minutes before coming on this show.
Woohoo!
Nerves Hub has a fairly major update. So Nerves Hub 2.x was in development for a decent amount of time, and then sort of the people involved kind of forgot that you have to tag a release for people to realize that it's happened. So people had been running 2.x happily in production for 6 months or so before 2.x was tagged. It might have been up to a year. I don't have the full history on that, but 2.x had been solid for a while. But we released 2.0.0 a while back. Now we got 2.1.0 of Nerves Hub and version 2.6.0 of Nerves Hub Link, which is the client library for devices. There's a bunch of bug fixes, improvements, smaller features that we don't need to get into. But then there's two major things. So there is an extensions mechanism, which is a way of letting us use the connection your device has to the Nerves Hub. So Nerves Hub provides firmware updates for Nerves devices. It's fairly critical. So for example, if you're SmartRent, you have, what I hear is about 100,000 Nerves devices in production. They all have a connection to a Nerves Hub. And when a new release of the SmartRent firmware needs to go out, it gets distributed that way. If there are major problems with a single device, their engineers can help troubleshoot it through Nerves Hub and also ship test updates that way. Like, this is what Nerves Hub is for. And this is very important. And we don't want to break this. So when building an extension mechanism to be able to do some more fun and featureful things in Nerves Hub, it's very important not to break firmware updates. That's why this is an extension mechanism and not just some random feature on top of the existing WebSocket. So it's a mechanism for safely building out new functionality on top of the WebSocket. It's very much after you've established and checked for firmware updates, you're fine to start switching on the optional features. And at any time, you can switch off these new optional features at runtime from Nerves Hub. So if your devices start randomly power cycling because you switched on a hog wild new feature that we invented, we're not that wild, but still, if you do, or if you have some kind of problem, because maybe you hooked some bad code into one of the extensions, you can switch it off on the server side directly from the UI, and it will just stop being enabled. It's a very careful way of adding more functionality and still using the same connection, because more overhead is not very desirable in the embedded space. So reusing the connection is great. Disrupting the connection is terrible. So we try not to do that. And the two extensions that are currently being funneled over this WebSocket is device health. So that's metrics about CPU usage, disk usage, memory usage, load averages, that kind of thing. Some custom metadata if you want to pass it along. We are also working on a nice way to report alarms. So Erlang alarms. There's some back and forth. We have an implementation, but it might see some revision. Then there's also geolocation support. The basic version, if you just switch it on, is that you get GeoIP. We hit an endpoint on the internet, get you some geo information, and it's a best effort. But of course, if your device has GPS or LTE, you can look that stuff up and get a very detailed position. And this matters for some devices and doesn't matter for some. So you can switch it on or off if you like. But yeah, this is a major release. There's also a good teaser built into this release. There's an entirely new UI coming for Nerves Hub.
Wow.
And we put a lot of effort into it. SmartRent has helped fund the designers. It's a very nice collaborative effort, and I'm spending most of the time that I spend on Nerves Hub right now just doing hardcore CSS work on implementing this design. So the 3 or 4 pages that you can access if you switch to the new UI in Nerves Hub, that's me and Josh cranking away at just chipping away at the CSS of this thing, because there's a lot of improvements that could be made to the Nerves Hub UI. It's very functional as it is, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and some really fancy fruit that we want to get.
Fancy fruit.
So that's what's happening.
That's cool, because I think it's neat when you're able to bring in designers, because lots of times the tooling that we create for ourselves, developers for other developers, it can be ugly but functional, right?
Yeah.
So it's really nice when it's like, oh, this has some thoughtful design and it's pretty.
Yeah, and we might get into how some of this comes about when we get into what I've been up to, but I believe we have a few more news items to hit.
Next up, it's kind of a follow-up. Remember Elixir Stream Week when we had the big streaming thing where it was all about Elixir Web RTC, and it was 5 days of speakers talking about really cool stuff in Elixir. And so there was a blog post over on softwaremansion.com, their blog. It's Elixir Stream Week, how not to load test during a live Elixir run broadcast watched by hundreds of devs.
Yeah, so this is a nice, very self-aware blog post by the lovely team behind Membrane and Elixir Web RTC. Like, Software Mansion is doing a ton of work that no one else dares to do, which I think is impressive. It was bold to put on a live stream like that, and it's also the absolute correct way to show you have some confidence in the tech you're putting together.
Absolutely.
And also, then when you have some troubles where Jose Valim ends up being turned on his side repeatedly from many viewers, then you also make a blog post about how it didn't go exactly as planned, which is like the exactly right thing to do. And yeah, it's a fun read, pretty quick as well. I mean, the membrane efforts and the Elixir WebRTC stuff is like so many of the things I like about the Elixir ecosystem. It's not just like, oh, we put together some bindings for a library. It's kind of useful. No, they're only doing audacious stuff. It's like everything is an attempt to do what others do by C and C++, mostly in Elixir and mostly with R primitives and in a more robust and interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
So like keep an eye on what the membrane folks are doing, even if you don't know what you need it for now. Like they're always up to something.
Yeah, it's cool stuff. And last up for the news, it's not really Elixir news, but I just wanted to put on people's radar. I noticed that Amazon AWS announced Aurora DSQL. We already have the AWS acronym soup of all of their products. So this is Aurora DSQL. Like, what the heck is that? All right, well, we have a link to their marketing-ish kind of landing page that introduces it. But really what it is it is a purpose-built, distributed, Postgres-compatible, serverless database. Postgres-compatible and distributed. That's really the big things, right, that I want to touch on. So they describe it as a distributed SQL database with virtually unlimited scale, the highest availability, and zero infrastructure management. All right, zero infrastructure management. I like the sound of that. That sounds nice. It's a good marketing piece, right? Okay, you hooked my interest a little bit. So Aurora DSQL offers the fastest distributed SQL reads and writes and makes it effortless for you to scale to meet any workload demand without database sharding or instance upgrades. With its active-active distributed architecture. So active-active, that's something MySQL had for a long time, which is I can have a instance of MySQL, and then I can just take another instance and add it to it. That's the active-active, and then it can just kind of join that cluster and start serving up requests. That's what they're saying this also does, is active-active distributed. And Aurora DSQL ensures strong data consistency designed for 99.99, so that's 4 nines, for single region, and 5 nines, 99.999% multi-region availability. All right, so why are we talking about this in an Elixir podcast? Well, Fly.io made it really easy to go multi-region, and they made that so much simpler. But
for your app servers.
For app servers, exactly. But the database is still something we have to solve for. And so there were a number of different ways that we did that at Fly, which was like replicated databases, having a local read-only replica, and then needing to do writes over on the primary. And that was working really well, and it's a good option. And then there's other options like CockroachDB or other Postgres-compatible databases that are multi-instance. So this is a new one. It's a new one to be aware of. When they say Postgres compatible, I expect that running an Elixir application on it won't have any problems. So I don't know what that means for all of the other extensions that you might be using, right? Like
you might find out that Oben acts weird or something.
Right.
Like I would not be certain about exactly what the guarantees are. And I believe that's the case with Cockroach as well.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't asked Parker about how that has gone. I'm sure some people have tried it and reported in, but...
Yeah, because like one of the ways that Oben is working is doing row-level locks to say, this job is only being processed by one processor at a time. So yeah, when it's distributed and you have multiple instances and you may temporarily lose a connection between them, what kind of guarantees do you have? Like, I don't know. So maybe it just means you have Oben only running in one location. Like that's probably the easiest solution anyway.
But yeah, this is super interesting. Like a well geo-distributed database is a bit of the holy grail of, well, a fully geo-distributed system where like you could build a web app and place it not in one place around the world, but in multiple places around the world and just keep adding them as you see the need.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not been fully realized. Like I gave a keynote at Gig City Elixir. I talked a little bit about Tigris, partially because they funded my trip there, which was very nice of them. But Tigris tackles like object storage very nicely for that use case. Fly does it for app servers. But there's no clean answer for the database in that kind of elastic way. Some people have responded with various distributed databases that can do the job, but it's very much like, oh, decide where you want them upfront.
Yep.
And I don't know what the story is for Aurora, but Aurora is already sort of serverless, scaled to zero type of deal. So I imagine this is also very flexible geographically, but I don't know.
Yeah. And really that's it. We don't have any personal experience with it. We don't know anyone who's tried anything with it yet, like with Elixir in particular. But the idea of being able to move the databases close to where my LiveView process is, so having the LiveView and the database close, and then having my LiveView close to my user gives an incredible experience. Like that's what we're after. And if this is another tool that might help in that goal, then we just want to be aware of it. So it's super early. We have to wait and hear how people, what their experience is like and what it works well for and what it doesn't, and how we might leverage it with our Elixir applications.
I'd also be curious to see how the pricing compares to various other offerings, because the fancier these proprietary clouds get, the pricier they also tend to be.
Well, yeah, because it's normal people and just simple devs don't need this particular feature. So this is like premium. You know, I could totally see that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know what the pricing is.
Yeah, it might be gold-plated Aurora, but we don't know.
And that's it for the news. So Lars, while we've got you here, I want to just catch up with you and find out what some of the things that you're doing, because you mentioned some of the involvements you had with the Nerves Hub release. So presumably you're involved with Nerves Hub. What's going on?
Yeah, so it's been a little bit of a journey. So I've been in touch with the Nerves project since I started with Elixir, essentially. It was in like the golden era of like Phoenix presence, probably was recent. And I saw some talks by Frank Hunleth and Justin Schneck at the time and was like, oh, this Nerve stuff seems great, because I've been poking around with Raspberry Pis, and it's like the reproducibility of a project you set up on a Raspberry Pi a year ago is horrible. It's just like, do you remember which tutorial you followed, and will it still run the same today?
Right.
And which combination of tutorials did you do for your final project?
Yes.
Tutorial text on the internet does not compose cleanly as a Git repo. Yeah, so I was very much DIY and hobbyist at that point, but I did get involved and built a library for an e-ink display and stuff. And that got me into the Nerves community and ecosystem, because people were really nice and helpful. And it was the right size to get into, because like the Elixir and Phoenix channels on the Slack were a little bit too much traffic for me, but I felt like I could grasp all the Nerves activity personally. So that was a good starting point for me. I've ended up being fairly active in Elixir over the last few years, but I've always had like a soft spot for Nerves, and I've run like a Nerves workshop in Stockholm at one point before Codebeam when Frank was coming. So I invited him, and we had a lovely time. Small group, like we've kept in touch. And at some point it was like, yeah, okay, I've poked around enough with Nerves, and I don't remember exactly where it started, but at some point Frank needed some assistance at SmartRun. So he reached out to me and my colleagues, and some of us did some contract work for SmartRun. So that got me deeper and more active into Nerves. Around the same time, I picked up a client in Sweden as well that also wanted to focus on Nerves. So I went and had a workshop with them. I had a really fun time. And then I decided, like, let's focus in. Like, I've been doing Elixir as under the flag of Underjord for a while now. I know I want to do more Nerves stuff, so let's stake a claim that I will be doing Nerves stuff. So I did. Around the same time, this strange fella I'd never seen before, named Josh Calderamis, started to post about doing a hosted version of Nerves Hub. I was like, hadn't run into him before. Who's this guy? Odd. I'm familiar with most people in the Nerves space, I think. So I poked Frank and the crew about it, and they're like, yeah. He's been helping a bunch on Nerves Hub recently. Like he's helping maintain it, helping improve it. So I just chatted to him, and he was like, yeah, so want to come on board? Want to do Nerves Cloud together? I'm like, that seems like something different. I was really, really hesitant, and so And at some point I was instead really, really enthusiastic, and I went for it. So we're still cranking away, and the business is started, but as all sort of small scale startups go, it's a soft launch that feels like it takes forever, but it hasn't been that long. But we're producing a managed Nerves Hub offering. So Nerves Hub is, of course, the service that if you're building Nerves devices, and actually if you're building other devices as well, but Linux level devices, typically Nerves devices, usually need to provide firmware updates, or OTA, over the air updates, as it's called, where you update the firmware. It's software on your hardware, and it's more difficult than software, aka it's harder. So I guess that's why we call it firmware. I don't know for sure. It's like usually firmware is when you're talking about the stuff that's like packed into silicon.
Yeah.
Like this stuff really straddles the line in my eyes, but it helps to talk about it as firmware because it's one complete bundle, rather than like, oh, this is something in a container that you put on top of a container runtime. Like, no, we're shipping the whole thing. And Nerves Hub, it's a Phoenix app and a system for delivering that type of firmware. So when your Nerves fleet of 100,000 devices needs new firmware, Nerves Hub can deliver it. For some businesses, it makes sense to host it yourself, and you certainly can. Like, it's a Docker container, you can set it up. It's a very straightforward Phoenix app in many ways. 1.x was not. That was a very involved AWS heavy project. 2.x is simplified so that anyone can run it, really, which is not to our advantage as a business. But hey, we're trying to do the open source thing correctly. Both me and Josh were invited to help maintain Nerves Hub. So it's usually, the cadence is usually like me and Josh make some changes, and we have Frank and John or Nate over at SmartRent review, and we review their stuff. It goes back and forth between the parties involved. Occasionally we get drive-bys as well. Beyond becoming a maintainer of a Nerves Hub, I also got invited to the Nerves core team. I had been sort of a hang-around for the Nerves core team for a while. I've written the Nerves newsletter for over 3 years. At one point I was like, hey, actually, if I'm going to do like presentations about Nerves and stuff, maybe it would make sense if I'm on the core team, even if I'm just the marketing department.
Just so that you have the insight and you can ask questions like, what does this mean? And can you confirm that this is coming out at this time? Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Am I completely wrong if I say this?
Yeah.
I asked Frank, and he was like, yeah, I was planning to invite you like a year ago, and then I forgot. Like now I'm sort of putting Frank on blast here, but I thought it was adorable. It's been sort of an unofficial thing. But yes, I'm officially part of the Nerves core team, and sometimes I even touch the code. But I mostly try to help where I'm most helpful, which is I don't mind writing up things. I'm happy to communicate for the project. And it can sometimes be a quiet project, but it has been drumming along for many years now.
Yeah, one of the challenges I've had, so I'm grateful that you have like this resource of the Nerves newsletter, because one of the challenges I've had is when we try to cover things that are happening in the Nerves space, we'd see some news. And if you're not actively in that space, in the Nerves space, and someone says, oh, now this particular hardware, insert weird name, is supported. It's like, I don't know what that means. I don't know who cares about that. I don't, it's like, I don't have enough context to be able to say why this is important. I think it's great that there's a resource that you're making the effort to say, hey, here's how you can understand what's going on in this community, with these projects, and why you should care.
Were you not excited by the Buildroot 2024-08.2 update?
I didn't know what it meant.
Did that not shake your world? Are you not very keen on seeing the developments of the TI AM62X system for like Texas Instruments Citara boards? No?
See, that's the kind of stuff where like if you're in that space and like, oh, I've been waiting for this particular hardware. It's like, I know what that means. I know what I can use that hardware for. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. No, it's approaching the Nerves project is not that difficult, and getting started with it is not difficult. A lot of people get the mistaken assumption that like Nerves is for DIY and hobbyists. because they see that we have a bunch of support for Raspberry Pis, and they see all the conference talks that are about, like, I did something fun with Nerves.
Right.
And I think people should do fun things with Nerves, but Nerves was not made for DIY or hobbyists. Nerves was born out of the very long experience of production workloads that Frank Hunleth has, and his ideas around how like Erlang principles would map to like the embedded Linux type of level.
Yeah.
So Nerves is like a framework encapsulating those experiences and the experiences of everyone who's contributed since. And we have support for the Raspberry Pi, partially because it's like very popular for prototyping and also used heavily in like industrial and embedded. But then there's also just the convenience of like, oh, what do developers have that they could get started with? And a lot have accidentally bought a couple of Raspberry Pis at some point, at least one.
It's fun because with the Raspberry Pi, it's a little bit more general purpose. It comes with a lot more stuff on chip or on little board than you would want for production, something where you want it more pared down.
I would say it comes with a very odd set, honestly. If you look at like more industrial friendly prototype oriented boards, like the BeagleBone Black and its sort of natural siblings that are perhaps newer and more capable, they usually have like more various types of I/O. They have more capabilities. What the Raspberry Pi can do weirdly well is drive displays. The Raspberry Pi 4 can drive two 4K displays at 60 hertz, I believe. And the only reason why that is because it was built to be like video set-top boxes. Like that's what the chip on the Raspberry Pi is for. That also means it has no good security story.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of security limitations, I should say. It has a basic secure boot implementation, but no good secure storage. And that's a headache of mine, personally, in projects. But most other boards can drive the type of displays you want to drive as well. The reason that Raspberry Pi is picking that particular Broadcom chip is that they can make it incredibly cheap, and it has a lot of just raw CPU grunt. And it has a decent like GPU driver story.
Yeah.
So it's a very odd chip for many embedded use cases, but it's so common at this point.
Yeah, just partly because of how cheap it was, and then it was being used a lot with just general intro to programming and...
Yeah, it's an on-ramp to toying with hardware. Like I'd never poked hardware before I picked up a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
Never. So I don't have that background. I'm a web developer by background. My first impulse for an embedded project would be like, okay, let's ship Raspberry Pi OS, I guess, or ship Debian. Like Debian, no one gets fired for choosing Debian. Is that the saying? No, I think it was IBM.
Yeah, okay. Debian's a bad choice. It's like, really, Debian?
I love Debian, but I don't love Debian as an embedded long-term maintenance OS.
Yeah.
Because when you run apt-get update, apt-get upgrade, what do you end up with? Or are you going to be pinning all the dependencies very carefully every time?
Right.
While with Nerves, you maintain your exact system. You can lean on like the development of the Nerves core team that maintains like, build root updates, which means Linux updates, which means Erlang and Elixir updates. You can get those and just rebase on top of those or bring those in. But most embedded projects are like long-term. There's a lot of long-term maintenance, and knowing what's in your system and getting to know that is very important for your sanity. Being able to reproduce things, being able to ship the exact same thing, that stuff is important. And there are sort of more open-ended and mix and matchy types of systems for putting together the fundamental Linux. Nerves has a Linux underpinning, and that's the build root I mentioned very briefly. So build root is a way of building an embedded Linux. It is a very explicit way of building an embedded Linux. It's like, here we define our things. It's explicit, it's very clear, it's very specified. And Nerves takes that another step, I would say, in that if you clone the Raspberry Pi 4 system for Nerves, it explicitly specifies like this is an opinionated way of running a Raspberry Pi 4. It packed in a lot of the nice to haves just so that people can get started easily. You can remove them. You can add and remove things all you like and make your own custom system if you're going to production and you realize you don't need ALSA, for example. But fundamentally, like there the alternative to Buildroot is typically Yocto Linux, which is starting to form in my mind as like the enterprise embedded Linux. It has a lot of funding and a lot of support comparatively, but it is also the place where vendors go and like, hey, we have a Yocto layer, and if you need that part, you can just bring that in, and you bring that part in, and you bring that part in, and after a while, you don't know what your Linux actually is anymore. And for example, for a system like Nerves, we don't ship systemd. The way Nerves works is that we start Erlinit. Erlinit starts the beam and your Erlang runtime system. And the beam runs anything else that you need run. We orchestrate all our code from Elixir, meaning we can also do a bunch of the nice messaging. Like everything that you run on your Nerve system can ideally live within the Elixir paradigm. And that's a very nice high level way of working in this level of embedded system. So it's very, very opinionated in many ways, and very, very different from sort of just picking up a Linux and smacking it on a board.
So you mentioned Nerves Cloud, that you've been working on that project. Where do people go to get into that? Is that something that it's a product or a project? Like, can I sign up for it? Like, maybe you can tell us more about that.
nervescloud.com, all one word. You can go there and sign up for the early access list. I have the first invite email as a draft in my mailing list tool, so we will very shortly be inviting people. So final draft's happening there. And everyone will be welcome to just sign up and do like personal projects. It's going to be, we expect to hold a 10 device limit for personal use. Mm-hmm. And then just reach out to us if you have a commercial project. We're happy to talk you through the transition, because probably is worth having a conversation about that. But we're looking to offer a very straightforward managed Nerves Hub solution. There's nothing strange about it right now. It's entirely the open source version, and eventually we'll have a bunch of metering and billing that might not be open source, but hey, I don't think anyone wants it. If you're like, oh, he talked about Nerves, but I didn't actually grok Nerves because there's just a lot there. My talk from Codebeam Berlin is not out yet, so that won't help you, but I did give a talk at Dev in Sweden, but in English. And I think that was a pretty good overview of what Nerves is. Even if you're not an Elixirist, it might even apply, because most of the developers at that conference are not Elixirists. So we can give a link to that talk, because I think it will be a good intro. So then I have a bit of a weird one. And this is Thinking Elixir almost exclusive. I might launch this just before this episode comes out, but I haven't launched it when we record. I have a small website coming up called oswag.org, and the full explanation is the Open Swag platform, and that's a very silly name for what is essentially a place where you can buy Elixir shirts and Nerves shirts. So this is something I've wanted to exist, because I just like having a nice shirt with stuff I like on it. And I made some nice Nerves shirts for like Codebeam Berlin and stuff in collaboration with the Nerves project. Now I've talked to the Elixir core team and gotten the blessing from them to put out an Elixir shirt. And this is like a very minor for-profit business. Essentially, any proceeds goes to paying my wife a salary for packing and shipping these things. There's no real profit to this whole venture. The point is to make it possible to buy Elixir shirts. And for now, we're taking pre-orders on the Elixir shirt. It's available in black and in white. There's no mock-up for the white one because I don't own a white shirt. And there's the Nerves shirt, which already exists, and you can just order it. Yeah, you can read more about how we think about this and how we tackle it. And if you have any questions, reach out to us. Be nice and don't hassle like the Elixir core team about opinions about shirts. They just trusted me to try to do this nicely, and we'll do what we can to make people very happy. I like these shirts. I find them high quality. I have one that I made for my company. I've worn it like every week for 3 years, and I can't tell that it's worn. While like direct to garment printing I've done, just like it falls apart in 3 washes at most. I hope people will be excited for this. I have no idea how this will go, honestly. So the pre-order is to measure demand for one thing and figure out, like, if we printed 50 shirts, would it immediately just vanish, or will those stay with us forever?
And you'll just have shirts under the bed. Yes.
Yeah. So we're taking pre-orders, and sometime in the new year, we will fire that order off. We'll put a deadline on it eventually. But yeah, we're looking to launch this.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that this is using the official, it's like you can go check out oswag, oswag.org. And this has the official Elixir logo with the type, the Elixir font type that is used. Same for the Nerves logo and the Nerves type. And it's with permission, using these logos. So if you've been wanting to sport some swag, the brand of the tool that you love, this is a great option. And yes, I think you got to go check it out, because Lars is doing the modeling for one of the shots, himself. So yes.
I didn't have many options. My wife is gracious enough to also grace one of the shots. I'll also be clear, my logo is not on these shirts. There is no other branding aside from the shirt brand at the back of the neck on the inside. So, and that comes along with like a fair trade logo. So you can feel good about that. This is a fun effort. I don't expect it to be a big thing, but if it goes well, maybe I can convince more projects to be available on here. I think it would be cool if we can just keep this going as something where you can pick up this stuff. We can do stickers. We can do more things over time. Mm-hmm. I have the permission to do most anything as long as it makes sense.
That's a nice little service to the community, just making official swag available. Yeah, it's one of those things like you realize, oh yeah, we don't really have that.
At one point there were like Phoenix shirts, and I think Chris's wife made them for specific Elixir confs. It's like, yeah, that's kind of bespoke stuff. It's hard for someone in India or like the European mainland that doesn't travel much to get at. And we will ship as worldwide as we can. Like, there are geopolitical restrictions, but other than that, we'll ship.
Well, thanks, Lars, for coming on, helping me talk about these huge releases of LiveView 1.0. 6 years in the making, helping me talk about that and Elixir 1.18, and then giving us some more insight into what's going on in Nerves. Because unfortunately, it's something that I don't have the experience to be able to talk about with any level of intelligence. So thank you for coming on, helping us understand what's going on with Nerves Hub, Nerves Cloud, how that's something that will be shortly available to help people run a hosted Nerves Hub. Well, Lars, if people want to get in touch with you or follow what you're doing online, where should they go to do that?
The easiest way is to go to underjord.io. So underjord.io. It's my website. It has links to the Mastodons and the YouTubes and the Beam Radio podcast and the regular programming podcast and the newsletter. The newsletter is probably the best way to keep track of what I do, because I tend to summarize my activities every week in there.
Awesome. And we'll have some links to where we can find you on social media too in the show notes. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us next time on Thinking Elixir.